Welcome to the AI Policy Podcast, a podcast by the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies at CSIS. I'm Gregory C. Allen.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz.
Join us as we dive into the world of AI policy, where we'll discuss the implications of this transformative technology for national security, geopolitics, and global governance.
All right, we're back for another episode of the AI Policy Podcast. I'm Brielle Hill, the Associate Director for the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies, with my co-host, Greg Allen.
Hello.
Today, we're going to be talking about what's going on in Congress, international diplomacy, and big updates for national security uses of AI. So let's just jump right into it. On May 15th, a bipartisan group of senators led by Senator Chuck Schumer released a legislative roadmap for AI in a document titled Driving U.S. Innovation in Artificial Intelligence. This document is the culmination of a year-long effort Senator Schumer first announced at CSIS last year, actually with your program.
He did. I was on the stage.
Yeah, and you then later took part in one of the AI Insight forums. So can you give us an overview of what's going on with this roadmap?
Sure. Well, I think it's worth taking us back to that speech that Senator Schumer made at CSIS last summer. And he said that AI was an urgent legislative priority. And he also said that the traditional committee process of having hearings in the sort of standard format was not going to be able to get it done and was not going to be able to get it done fast enough. And he had hoped that they would achieve comprehensive AI legislation under his safe innovation framework. Well, we're now close to a year out from that original goal, and we do not have comprehensive AI legislation, but what we do have is this roadmap document, which is mirroring the various sessions and topics that they had in the course of those Insight forums. This covers areas like privacy and liability, safeguarding against AI risk, explainability, intellectual property, copyright, national security, supporting innovation, the workforce, and more and more. So there's quite a few of these different topics. There was one Insight forum for every one of these topics. And now there's one section in the report for each of these topics. So I participated in the national security session, and there is a national security section of the report. I think the report overall is interesting because in some ways, it actually goes back to the idea that committees should be doing this. And I think that's especially true on the regulatory side of the equation. So it talks about the need for a federal data privacy law, and it thinks about the way AI regulation should be done, not in the horizontal manner that the European Union did it, but again, in the vertical manner, so that there will be AI regulations in the financial sector, in the energy sector, in the employment and hiring sector, and so on. But I do think this is a big development and does actually give me some confidence that there's some possible legislation that might be taken up and passed this year, although that would obviously require the cooperation not just of the Senate, where Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is in the driver's seat, but also the House, where Republicans and Speaker Mike Johnson are in control.
Yeah, so the theory here is that each of those individual committees has a level of expertise on those topics, and then the AI regulation will stem from that specific subset of expertise.
I think so. And one thing that is interesting here is that there's been a lot, dozens, maybe even hundreds, literally, maybe even hundreds of different pieces of legislation introduced to try and address AI. But some of that has actually been coming out of the committee process. So the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, for example, met on May 15th to discuss three big pieces of legislation related to AI and its impact on elections, which is one of the most hot button issues. There's the Protect Elections from Deceptive AI Act, which deals with deepfakes, among other things, introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar. There's the AI Transparency in Elections Act, also introduced by Senator Klobuchar with Senator Murkowski. And then finally, the Preparing Election Administrators for AI Act, introduced by Senators Klobuchar and Collins. So the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, I think, is indicative of a process that Senator Schumer has evidently become more comfortable with, which is the idea that, especially on the AI regulation side, the committees are going to be playing a big role here.
And we've seen quite a bit of bipartisanship with AI as a topic generally. Do you expect that that'll continue in each work stream moving forward on this roadmap?
I think there's actually cause for optimism here. Obviously, the Gang of Four in the Senate, led by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, is a bipartisan Gang of Four. And in the House, there's the bipartisan AI task force. So I think that something actually could pass this year. But if I was to guess, I would say it's most likely going to be some of these more subject-specific burning platform kind of topics like election interference and deepfakes for deceptive media. There's also the big question about how much to spend on AI, which naturally would go to the Appropriations Committee. And I think what's interesting here is that the report by the Gang of Four echoes the recommendation in the earlier National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence recommendation for $32 billion in non-defense spending related to AI. And I thought what was really interesting here is that the senators have not actually disclosed what they think the defense number should be, but Schumer stated, quote, "It's going to be a very large number," end quote, which I think is really interesting here. So I'm going to go a little bit into the weeds of defense budgeting here just because I think it's interesting. The defense AI numbers are actually kind of difficult to count. Imagine trying to count how much the Department of Defense spends on software, for example, right? You buy software like Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, but you also buy software for the software that drives every tank or drives every plane and the software that manages logistics platforms, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is software is a kind of a piece of everything. And similarly, AI is a piece of very many things. And it's difficult to count how much all of that spending. So the number that the Department of Defense discloses every year is what's called the core AI number. That's the amount of money that's for programs that are specifically focused around AI as the core principle of what they're actually trying to accomplish and what they're trying to build. But there's a lot of other programs of record across the Department of Defense that are using AI to some greater or lesser extent, and that's very often not counted. So when Schumer says it's going to be a very large number, what I would assume is that he's talking about the core AI number going up a lot. And that could include new programs of record, like what we're seeing happen with the collaborative combat aircraft, getting a pretty big budget request, and then more on that nature. I recall from the conversation that we had that tens of billions of dollars was absolutely the kind of number that was being thrown around for defense AI spending. And that would be a noteworthy increase.
So how does Senator Schumer's proposal compare to some of the other major AI regulations we have seen, such as the EU AI Act?
Well, this is a report, which is not quite a full proposal, but I do think it's still worth comparing it to the EU AI Act. When Senator Schumer was here at CSIS, he had said that he didn't think the EU AI Act approach had gotten it quite right and that we were going to do things our own way. I think a couple interesting things have happened since he said that. Number one, the EU AI Act has changed a lot. The final month of negotiation around the EU AI Act saw a pretty significant moderation of some of the regulatory strictures that were in there. That was necessary to bring along Germany, France, and Italy in particular to supporting the EU AI Act. And some of the important provisions of the EU AI Act have actually been discussed in international forums like the G7. So the United States has had a bit of an impact on the EU AI Act. Similarly, the U.S. and EU Trade and Technology Council has been trying to align on definitions of key terms that are important for regulation. So whether or not, I'm sure that Senator Schumer thinks that what the United States is going to do is going to be closer to the right answer. He wouldn't do it if he didn't think that that was true. But I do think that there's some opportunity for more collaboration on areas like interoperability than there was in the past. And there's been more mutual influence between the U.S. and the EU, even though it's still appropriate to say that there's a considerable difference in how strict in terms of regulation they want to be.
And then in terms of domestic policy, does this path of regulation interact with the White House executive order that was released in October 2023 at all?
Well, Senator Schumer was probably the first person who was briefed after the White House executive order went out. That meeting took place either the day of or the day after. And of course, because they're both part of the Democratic Party, there's been some close cooperation on all of these issues. But I think fundamentally, Senator Schumer is going to be asserting the privilege of Congress here to make decisions on areas like appropriations, right, with the power of the purse, and also to make decisions when it comes to these committee by committee type regulations. Now, the White House executive order requires a lot of these executive agencies to come up with plans. And so the relevant committees who oversee those executive agencies, I think their legislative proposals are, of course, at least in part, going to be a reaction to those plans.
Well, certainly this has been a recurring topic on the podcast. I'm sure we will revisit it very, very soon. But I want to move over into international diplomacy. On May 14th, government officials from both the U.S. and China met in Geneva for a first-of-its-kind dialogue on AI safety. At the time of this recording, an official statement has not yet been released after this conversation. But I'm wondering what you think the primary focus of this dialogue was and what you think the Biden administration hoped to gain from it.
Sure. So this is a high-level meeting between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in the White House team and then Director Wang, his most direct analog in the Chinese national security establishment. I think the first most notable thing is this is the seniority of the officials who are meeting on this topic. When I was in the Department of Defense, we had proposed having dialogues between the Department of Defense and the People's Liberation Army, but that was led by on the Chinese side, the equivalent of, I believe it was a 1-star or a 2-star general, right? Jake Sullivan is like a 5-star general equivalent in the United States system. He's the senior most official other than the president when it comes to most matters of national security. And he's personally quite invested as AI is a topic. And one of the benefits that you get when you have that level of seniority is that it forces all the relevant parties in the Chinese side to get together and talk, which in any big country like the United States or China, the interagency process, making sure that various ministries are actually talking to each other and comparing notes with each other, actually these diplomatic efforts can be one of the reasons why those things actually happen. And so on the Chinese side, they've had to coordinate the various ministries. This is like the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Cyberspace Administration of China, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and on and on and on. And I think that is actually kind of interesting in and of itself, right? I should add one other thing, which is the NDRC, which is sort of the Foreign Affairs Office of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So getting together all of these different entities and actually having them state their opinion on AI safety, I'm not sure that a ton of substantive impact is likely to come out of this, but I do think that it's actually worth just building these people-to-people ties between the two countries on this. I also want to emphasize here that there's been some noteworthy change in the words that the White House is using to describe this. Previously, there was a lot of talk about engagement. And engagement is meant to embody this sort of substantive back and forth partnership, trying to reach agreement. And what we're hearing now out of the White House is much more of a focus on diplomacy, which is to say that China is probably not going to be our partner on this area. We're not going to engage with China to have some kind of cooperative arrangement around AI safety. That's pretty unlikely here. But we still do need diplomacy with our strategic competitor, or with what many people would call the United States' strategic adversary, because you have to manage the risks of crises or unintended consequences of the development of advanced AI systems. So on the U.S. side, the primary interlocutors in this process are Tarun Chhabra, who's a senior director for technology and national security at the White House National Security Council, and then Seth Center, who is at the State Department and a senior executive over there. So this meeting happened last week, and I think the readout, that is available in the press, the sort of public reporting on this, is that it was not a grand slam, epic diplomacy effort. But I think expectations should have been pretty modest. This was really the first communication of its time, and I think the White House really views it as just getting these lines of communication open so that folks know who their counterparts are and can engage, I guess not engage is what I should say,
right,
so that they can talk to them if, a crisis or meaningful situation erupts where they need to be talking.
So in that same stream of opening up these channels for diplomacy, moving on from language that may have indicated a larger degree of participation and engagement, so to speak, the U.S. government has recently pressed China hard to match U.S. declarations that AI would not be used to make decisions related to the deployment of nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's likely that the U.S. will actually get assurances from Beijing on this point, even if it's just in the diplomatic sense?
Well, I think this has to be wrapped in the larger context of what's going on with China's nuclear policy. China has not historically been a significant participant in any of the major nuclear arms control regimes that the United States and the Soviet Union or the United States and Russia have had. But China had historically had a very small nuclear arsenal, just of its own sort of strategic decision making, had kept the numbers of weapons in the single-digit hundreds rather than, in the case of the Soviet Union and the United States, the thousands or tens of thousands of weapons. So that is changing. China is currently on track to, I want to say, quadruple the size of its nuclear force. They're expanding nuclear testing facilities, which nuclear tests are explicitly banned in one of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and other treaties on testing in various different environments around the world. So China's nuclear policy is changing a lot, and it's changing a lot very, very fast. And China is building, new types of weapons, such as hypersonic weapons, very aggressively. And those are weapons that actually make life harder if you're thinking about reducing the risk of accidental nuclear war. The U.S. is doing this as well, of course, but China has moved much more aggressively into this area in terms of the number of tests. So a lot is changing in China's thinking on nuclear weapons. At the intersection of AI and nuclear weapons, there has been a statement of U.S. policy on this topic, such as the nuclear posture review that the Biden administration revealed, which basically said that nuclear command and control is always going to have a human in the decision-making process for the use of nuclear weapons. Mike Horowitz, who's the current Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development and also Emerging Technology at the Department of Defense, he echoed this statement and basically said that this is where the United States wants to go, not just for itself, but also internationally. In terms of China, there have been senior former Chinese military officials who have stated publicly and on the record that they would support some kind of prohibition around the use of AI and nuclear weapons. But in terms of actual policy, there's not a lot publicly on the record for how China, views these issues. And I doubt that that was revealed in the course of this diplomatic engagement. But if it ever was going to be revealed publicly, if some kind of agreement was going to be reached, it probably would have started with something like this engagement. So there have been senior former Chinese military officials who have made statements on the record supporting some kind of prohibition on the use of nuclear weapons controlled by AI systems. But there's nothing on the record from Chinese officials about Chinese policy on this issue. And if something like that is going to happen, I doubt it would come out of this first meeting that we just had in Geneva. But this first meeting could be planting the seeds for something later on that topic. And China has sort of expressed how it didn't want nuclear weapons used by Russia in Ukraine, for example. But this is kind of a different animal. And historically, China's view on arms control has been, we don't want to have the arms control conversation until we feel like we're ahead in that military domain, in that military technology. So we'll see.
Yeah, and on our team, we talk a lot about the international regulations that are happening and how China is not a large part of those conversations generally. However, they have been invited to be a part of the ministerial meetings for the AI safety summits. So as we're wrapping up talking about diplomacy that happened this last week, diplomacy is happening this week as this podcast is being aired. Where are you headed?
That's right. So I'm headed to Seoul in the Republic of Korea, where the Seoul AI Summit is the official successor to the UK AI Safety Summit of last year. And then there's also the AI Global Forum. It's a weird back-to-back conference structure, but the two events are extremely related, but only the Seoul AI Summit is the one that actually has the ministerial meetings of various governments and the leaders meeting of various governments to continue with the discussions around AI safety in particular. So I think the readout from that visit we'll have actually on the next podcast when I get back from Seoul, but that's another big bit of AI diplomacy going on.
Yeah, looking forward to hearing about it. We're going to switch now over to big updates for national security uses of AI, starting with the Replicator initiative. So on May 6th, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks announced that the DoD secured around $500 million in funding for the Replicator initiative, in addition to some of the specific capabilities and systems that the efforts will focus on. What can you tell us about this announcement, and why does it matter now?
Sure. So I think the first thing, and this is a little bit wonky, but is the how they got the money. So this $500 million was via a reprogramming request. So it depends on the size, and this is big enough that I do believe that they would have to ask the relevant appropriations committees, is it okay for us to use this money that you said we were going to use for this? We'd like to instead use it for that. So they had to go back and get that permission. That's how they can move money before the next congressional appropriation cycle. So they've got $500 million to use for the remainder of fiscal year 2024, and there's not a ton of time left in fiscal year 2024. It's going to end on September 30th. So what are they using that money to buy? Well, when you have a lot of money and not a lot of time to buy it, you have to go do stuff that you already have permission to buy through a contracting vehicle. So as folks who listen to this podcast will remember, the Replicator initiative was focused on rapidly procuring in an 18 to 24 month time frame attritable autonomous systems. So systems that are so cheap that you can buy a lot of them and you don't necessarily care if you lose a lot of them. And then autonomous, meaning that a lot of the command and control functions is actually happening on board, potentially even using various AI capabilities as the future of this military power projecting capabilities.
So what actually are they buying?
Well, there's a few things that have been public, and then there's additional classified capabilities that the department is not talking about. So the first big thing is one that will be familiar to folks who are following the war in Ukraine, which is the AeroVironment Switchblade 600 loitering munition. And that is a munition that historically has not been an autonomous weapon in the DoD policy sense of that word, but it does have some autonomous capabilities, mostly for navigation. And what's interesting here is that AeroVironment is claiming that the Switchblade uses AI to automatically identify targets and has a unit cost of around $80,000 per platform. So that target identification using AI, that actually does not trigger the DoD 3000.09 review, which would be required for an autonomous weapon system, because that standard is, again, something that folks who listen to this podcast will know, is select and engage targets, not identify targets. When you say identify, that means some human has already said, this is the thing I want you to go get, and then the AI is just used to confirm that you've got that, similar to like heat-seeking missiles that have already been locked on.
The human-in-the-loop conversation.
Yeah, this is related to the human-in-the-loop conversation. These things are $80,000 per platform. So that is cheap when you think about in comparison to, say, a Tomahawk cruise missile, but it is expensive when you compare it to something like a DJI drone. So I think what the military is hoping is that they found this sort of sweet spot. I think one thing that will really determine the success of this program, there were some bad reviews that had leaked out in reports from the war in Ukraine about the Switchblade in its first, months being used in the environment. I think one of the things that we've consistently heard as feedback from the Ukrainian military is that no drone is actually ready to go and ready to fight in the war in Ukraine, or at least was not ready to fight on its first day. And that's a testament to just how fast the pace of innovation has been on both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. The stuff that we thought was going to be state-of-the-art in drones circa February 2022, it's just very different now. This is a really rapidly updating field. And so I hope that the DoD, when they say they're going to buy these Switchblade 600s in large quantities, they're talking about an upgraded version of the Switchblade 600 that takes into account the very extensive knowledge that the Ukrainian military has acquired about what works and what doesn't work in this real war.
So what else are they buying?
So the next system is a counter UAS system, counter unmanned aerial system, and that's called the WISP. Now, this is a product made by Anduril, which, whereas AeroVironment was considered, a defense startup like literally over a decade ago. Anduril is a much younger company and is one of these noteworthy firms because it's backed by so much of the venture capital ecosystem as a defense tech startup. It's a defense unicorn. And at least according to the publicly available reports, and this has not yet been confirmed by the Department of Defense, but Anduril is, according to these reports, part of Replicator with its WISP system, the Wide Area Infrared for Persistent Surveillance. So this is more AI-enabled autonomy for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which really does matter. It's not the killer robots kind of use case that most people imagine when they think about military AI, but this is something that folks do want. Then we leave the aerial domain to talk about the water domain. Folks who are following the war in Ukraine will know that the Ukrainian military has had some very successful strikes on the much larger, much more expensive systems of the Russian Navy just by using unmanned surface vessels, basically speedboats with a bunch of explosives and sensors on them to go do suicide missions attacking Russian ships. So according to a recent DIU solicitation, they're looking for what they call production-ready, inexpensive maritime expeditionary platforms, or PRIME platforms. DoD absolutely loves acronyms, as everyone knows. And they really, I think it's actually worth quoting here what the solicitation called for. They're looking for, quote, systems that, quote, are capable of autonomously transiting hundreds of miles through contested water space. Interceptors will need to operate in cohesive groups and execute complex autonomous behaviors. Well, I think that is a real vote of confidence for what the Ukrainian military has been doing with unmanned surface vessels, and a sign that the Department of Defense really wants to go in there. So those are the three big things that have been reported that are unclassified. Of course, there's additional classified capabilities, which the Department of Defense isn't going to talk about.
Of course, but now that we've gone over more of the technology that they're hoping to acquire with this $500 million in funding, I want to ask you a little bit more about how Replicator is going to be implemented. Is it significant that the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, led by former Apple executive Doug Beck, is now the current DoD component that is responsible for implementing the Replicator initiative?
Well, it's a big change for DIU and how it works. So historically, DIU's budget has been in the tens of millions of dollars, and I oftentimes refer to it as the Department of Defense's embassy in Silicon Valley. It is primarily an outreach and engagement type function plus acquisitions. So, over the past decade or so, DIU has really set itself apart as an acquisitions office that, one, has good ties to the commercial technology startup ecosystem, but then also, uses specific acquisition authorities like other transaction authority, which is different from the incredibly bureaucratically intensive traditional DoD contracting process. So that's what they were able to do when they had tens of millions of dollars, run a sort of pseudo embassy and run an innovative acquisitions shop. Now they are buying the stuff themselves. They are not saying, here is the contract, rest of DoD, please use our contracts to buy stuff. They are now just buying the stuff. And the Department of Defense FY24 defense spending bill, that gave DIU a budget of $983 million. That's up from the $191 million of the previous year and way up from what it was in the Trump administration, which, as I said, was just single-digit tens of millions of dollars. This is a big change, and Replicator really is a vote of confidence from the DoD leadership and Congress that DIU and Doug Beck are ready to handle this kind of challenge.
So as this is the AI policy podcast, I want to talk about the policy issues that Replicator may raise. For example, how does Replicator play into the DoD's autonomous weapons system policy? I think you mentioned a little bit about it earlier, but what does this look like going forward?
Well, I think it's worth saying what the announcements so far have not said, which is whether or not any of the systems that are being procured as part of Replicator are going to trigger the senior review process that is required in Department of Defense Directive 3000.09 in order to buy an autonomous weapons system that is going to be used for offensive kinetic strikes. There's no official confirmation that any system has triggered a 3000.09 review, and I think it's pretty safe to say at this point that we're probably not going to hear about it from the Department of Defense, when they actually exercise that authority. I think that's something that they're going to want to keep close to the chest. Maybe we'll hear about it, when the systems start being used, but I doubt we're going to hear about it when the development of those systems get kicked off. So perhaps Replicator is the first program to cross that threshold. Perhaps not. We're probably not going to know for a while.
All right, moving over to the intelligence community for a minute. Earlier in the month, Microsoft announced that a version of generative AI model GPT-4 will now be available via a top-secret cloud environment. This represents the first confirmed generative model that was specifically created to handle classified workloads. And I'm wondering what the major differences are between this tool and what is available to the general public.
Well, I think the biggest difference, of course, is that it's not connected to the internet. So GPT-4 can access the internet, access information on the internet, can perform functions by, calling various capabilities that are available through the internet. And all of that is designed to maximize the user experience of the user. But if you're in the Department of Defense, when you connect something to the internet, it sure as heck better not be classified information that you're connecting to the internet. And so the intelligence community has been thinking, how can they make use of generative AI? How can they get the benefits of what exists in commercial technology? But how can they do that with their very unique security requirements? So this is actually going to exist, according to the announcement, in an isolated, air-gapped Azure government top secret cloud. And that's for use by both the intelligence community and the Department of Defense. And because it's not connected to the internet, it's going to operate in a static configuration, meaning it can read files but not learn from them. They're not going to do another training run on that classified stuff. And I think that is the only compromise that was really available for near-term utilization in the top secret environment. The intelligence community has to do an awful lot of content generation when they're putting out all of these intelligence reports. And I'm sure that one of the first things that they're thinking about is how can they get these capabilities available to their analysts so that they can do their work faster and have more of the benefits of generative AI. Of course, if you're the intelligence community, you care a lot about getting it right. Mm-hmm. And so hallucinations are not an acceptable outcome here, and not knowing the provenance of various information also not an acceptable outcome here. I'm sure those are problems that the intelligence community and Microsoft are thinking about together in order to actually make sure that these capabilities are useful. I suspect right now they're in the experimentation phase, and I think that's perfectly appropriate.
What would be some examples of the capabilities that tool will give the CIA and other intelligence agencies?
Well, I'll just talk about some interesting things that I've seen that are available in the unclassified space. When you have, in the intelligence community, you are oftentimes going through really large troves of files. Mm-hmm. Say somebody in the intelligence community recovers a hard drive from some kind of intelligence source, and then they want to know what's on that hard drive. Well, one way to go through that is to have a human being actually read every word of every file on that hard drive. But if there's tens of thousands of files, that's going to take a very, very long time.
A lot of resources.
Exactly. And if you could instead have an AI say, hey, look at all these files and tell me what's in them. Summarize the overall content of this files. Now, tell me which files you think are most interesting from an intelligence value perspective. Now, the analyst can go right to the heart of what's interesting. Now, that kind of capability has been available to some extent before. As everybody who has ever gone through a big PDF knows, you can use Control F to find certain keywords. But this is a much more semantic, much more closely approximated understanding of the document. And big PDF summary is, of course, one of the big uses of generative AI here among the Washington lobbyist community. And I suspect that the intelligence community is licking its lips as they think about being able to use it for their use cases. And again, right, this is mostly to direct analysts to the meat of what they're finding, not to really replace them, but to get them out of the reading every word and to, hey, go read these words. This should be your first priority.
Sure, that makes sense. But Microsoft has received a lot of criticism recently from the U.S. government about its cybersecurity practices. What does this latest announcement signal about their relationship to the national security community?
Yeah, and the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, actually put out a letter to all staff stating that they needed to have a security-first mindset, that they were in a new geopolitical era. And when you have, Microsoft doing the kind of critical cybersecurity work that they did to assist the government of Ukraine in the early months of the war, for example, they're a target. They're an incredibly high-profile target. And Microsoft is doing some really important work with the intelligence community, of which this is really only the tip of the iceberg. And so they're thinking about how can they actually bring their security practices to the appropriate level that's required by the importance that they occupy in the national security ecosystem. The U.S. Cyber Safety Review Board issued a pretty harsh report on Microsoft, and it's related to some breaches that reportedly, related to China, other breaches related to Russia, and some national security implications of those breaches. I don't happen to know anything beyond what's in the press here, but I do think that this is absolutely important. And the reason why they're doing this air-gapped system, the system that's not connected to the internet, is because of security, right? If it wasn't for security, they would just do it in the regular internet way. So this is bringing AI to the top secret environment, and to do that, you got to get security right.
Okay, Greg, I think that does it for this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Thanks again for having me on.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next episode, I'm looking forward to hearing more about your travels to South Korea. I hope that they're safe and productive.
Yeah, here comes jet lag.
Absolutely. Looking forward to having you back in the office right after that as well. For our listeners, you can always drop us a line at the AI Policy Podcast at csis.org. Let us know your thoughts and if you have any insights or topics that you would like for us to discuss in the future.
Yeah, and please do take use of that. We try to read all the feedback that we get from our listeners, and it's really helpful for us to know what's helpful for you to listen to.
And for those of you who have not already signed up to receive our newsletter, you can find the link in our show notes. We hope that you will keep track of all of the amazing insights that we have coming out here in the future.
Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to visit our website, csis.org, for show notes and our research reports. This podcast was produced by David Lotfi, Isaac Goldston, Isabel Burns, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.